our concluding seminar in the series, Horse and History. Yeah, we've got horses. And so today's topic is horses and the army. We'll have 3 speakers. Emma Herbert-Davies is going to talk about horses in the medieval period. Yuri Gassman is going to talk about also war horses, but not period specific. I think it's modern horses as well. And I'm going to talk about horses, war horses and gender, and about the Russian cavalry and women in the Russian cavalry and their relations with horses. And we will first have the papers, and then the discussion. If you have a burning question, you can put it in the chat. If it's less burning and you will remember it to the end of the papers, you can wait and have it in the general discussion. Then in the discussion, you can either raise your hand and unmute yourself and speak, or you can put the question in the chat, whichever way you prefer it. Right? So the first speaker is Emma Herbert-Davies. And Emma, do you want to share your screen? And know if you...
Okie dokie. Here we go. So hello everybody. Today I'm going to talk about restaurum equorum, or the compensation of horses during the reigns of Edward I and II. And there's been little research done to date on military horses during this period, and the lived experiences of horses taken on campaign has yet to be considered. And my investigations into restaurum equorum, while still a work in progress, explores the administrative processes involving war horses, and these in turn offer a unique window into the animals themselves. I'll firstly give an overview of the subject, and then address who was assessing the army's horses and what they were looking for, and then discuss whether the horses were branded. And finally, I'll look at the various terms used to describe what had happened to the horses for compensation to be applied. Restaurum equorum was a service offered by all 3 Edwards to paid men-at-arms on campaign. It was essentially an insurance policy for war horses, and this meant that if a horse fell sick or was injured or killed, a man-at-arms could claim financial reimbursement, allowing him to replace his horse without cost. The earliest extant records date to 1282 and were drawn up at the start of the Second Welsh War, and the last are dated around 1364. And as my thesis focuses on Edward I and II, this is the period that I'm going to be covering today. Now, restaurum equorum comprised of 2 sets of documents: the horse inventories and the restaurum accounts. The inventories were lists made at the beginning of a campaign and contained the names of mounted men-at-arms serving for royal pay, alongside a description of their horses and their horses' values. The restaurum accounts were based on information supplied by these inventories and recorded the amounts of compensation paid and to whom. The job of organising restaurum equorum fell to the royal wardrobe, and the king's clerks were responsible for its administration. And their job began when an army was called to muster, and clerks were sent to organise teams of suitable men to appraise the horses. The appraisal process involved inspecting each man-at-arms horse and recording its details in an inventory. Each retinue was generally recorded in a separate blocks, beginning with the leader of the retinue, followed by his knights and esquires. The example on the left is a list of men and appraised horses in the king's household on the Scottish campaign in 1298. And here you can see the left-hand margin has been annotated. These notes were added as compensation claims were brought forward, and usually consist of a brief description of what happened to a particular horse. And here, 2 were listed as interfectus, or having died at the Battle of Falkirk, and one was sent to the baggage train at Kirkliston. And I'll discuss these terms in more detail shortly. And once a claim had been put forward, it had to be approved. And this was normally conducted by the armies marshal or the king's clerk associated with drawing up the original inventory. The horse was inspected so it could be matched against its description in the documents, and this ensured that the correct value was paid. Injured animals were assessed to determine if their wounds were significant enough to withdraw them from service. And dead horses would also have been inspected if the body was accessible. And if this couldn't be done, for instance, if a horse had been killed some distance away, a sworn testimony as to its death, verified by the retinue captain, normally sufficed. Once a claim was approved, the inventory was annotated, the horse was struck out of the list, and a certificate was issued with the amount of compensation payable. This could then be presented to the Exchequer in return for payment. So that's a brief summary of how restaurum equorum worked, but I'll now take a closer look at what was perhaps the most critical part of the whole process, the actual appraisal of the horses. Horse appraisals inevitably involved a physical inspection of the animal so that its type, colour, markings, and most importantly, its value could be recorded. And this meant that the people doing the appraising had to be experienced horsemen, capable of judging horseflesh and able to offer accurate valuations. This horse inventory gives an insight into the type of men who were considered appropriate. At the top of the manuscript, it is recorded that on May the 30th, 1307, the horses at Kirkpatrick were appreciated in the presence of William de Roo, the king's clerk, who was in charge of overseeing this operation, and 5 other men, Sir Edmund Comyn, the armies marshal Sir Roger St. John, and 3 other officers. So we have here a number of high-ranking personnel who would have had a great deal of military and equestrian experience between them. So what were these equestrian experts looking for when a war horse was brought before them? The first detail to be recorded was the type of horse, and these fell into 3 main categories: the dexterous or destrier, the equus, which simply translates as horse, and the runcinus or roundsea. This image is taken from a printed edition of the horse inventories raised for the 1298 Scottish campaign, and I've used it as it clearly shows the 3 types, with the destrier marked in red, the equi in blue, and the rounseys in yellow. And this is part of Hugh the Dispenser's retinue, and the fact that he alone is mounted on a destrier is not unusual. They were almost always only ridden by wealthy retinue leaders, and this is due to their high cost. The destriers in this particular inventory were valued between 14 to 120 marks, with most falling around the 50 mark mid-range. And to put this in context, this represented almost a lifetime's wages for the average labourer, and was still a substantial investment for a wealthy man, such as the dispenser. The equi were almost always ridden by knightly men-at-arms, and they were a little bit more affordable. But their prices could vary enormously. In this inventory, one was valued as low as 100 shillings, but another was as high as 100 marks. And this wide range of values was probably influenced by the animal's size, age, and overall condition. But on average, the equus was priced around 20 to 40 marks. Rounseys were ridden by the lowest ranking members of a retinue, the valetti, or esquires, and they cost around 10 marks, although some, like the ones here, could reach 30. But what's really noticeable about all the inventories I've studied is that destriers, which are what most of us consider to be the medieval warhorse per se, made a pony a tiny minority, between 2.5% and 5% of military mounts. 3/4 of the horses in Edward I's armies were rounseys, and the most common knightly horse was simply referred to as an equus. After the type of horse was described, its colour and markings were noted, And these were really important details because when claims were made, the horse had to be easily identifiable so the correct amount of compensation could be allocated. This meant that colour terms were complex, often including shade and subtle variations in colour. For example, a white horse might be listed as white dappled, white grey, white iron grey, or white roan, and a skewbald or pied horse could be described as bay, bright bay, fawn, or even fawn, bay, pied, if its patches varied in tone. Sometimes the appraisers seemed unsure which words to use. Confusing examples include dappled dun bay, which might have been the result of an unresolved debate over a horse's specific colouring. Markings were also included in case any two horses were of a similar colour. And here are some of the variations of white markings which can be found on horse faces. But here is a puzzle, as the only facial marking noted in the inventories was the star, and very occasionally a white muzzle. The appraisers also noted the number of white feet a horse had, but not whether they had white pasterns, socks or stockings, as seen here. Why omit what were surely the most accurate ways to differentiate one horse from another? Or perhaps it was simply too time-consuming to include all these details. But there's another possible reason. It's quicker to rub away mud from a horse's hoof to check its colour rather than to clean 4 whole legs. And it's easier to wipe away a bit of dirt from a horse's forehead to check for a star than to wash its whole face. And the implication is that horse identification had to be done as quickly as possible, because you were, after all, likely to be in a war zone. And also missing from the descriptions are the horses' heights and ages. And it may have been that the process of measuring horses and checking their teeth to determine their age added yet more time to what was already a complicated and drawn-out process. Now, one interesting question raised by my investigations is, were any horses rejected by the appraisers? And it's possible that this sometimes did happen. A few may have been judged too old or poor quality, but it's unlikely that these would have been documented. There is, though, a reference in 1282 Welsh inventory which states that Sir Hugh de Dodinsell's horse had previous injuries and that no compensation should be paid if these were the cause of its death. And this suggests that appraisers were unwilling to insure animals that they thought might fall sick or break down under the rigours of a campaign. And a health inspection most likely formed part of the appraisal process. Evidence of this can be found in the Pisan Military Code of 1327, which stated that any horses showing signs of disease were to be rejected by the appraisers. 2 conditions in particular were mentioned. The first was balsam, which corresponds to the condition known as pulsivus by hippiatric authors. And this is a respiratory ailment that we used to call broken wind. Now, its more technical name is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And this would have severely affected the performance of a warhorse. The image here depicts a horse suffering from pulsivus, and the peculiar flame-like things coming from its mouth and nose are meant to indicate difficulties in breathing. Now, the second condition mentioned was capo moribus, which can be translated literally as an affliction of the head. And this may have referred to a range of clinical symptoms such as nasal discharge and swollen glands. And these could be indicative of several diseases, including strangles and glanders, which were prevalent in the Middle Ages and are still in circulation today. Despite the exclusion placed on Dodinsell's horse, some disabilities appear to be tolerated. In the 1298 inventory, there are 3 one-eyed horses, which were clearly judged suitable to join the campaign. And there are also 4 recorded as cum uno oculum in a French inventory from 1355. Such injuries were perhaps the result of wounds gained in previous campaigns and didn't seem to exclude a horse from further military service. Interestingly, losing an eye didn't always hugely devalue a horse. Bernetta de Stammer's one-eyed Roundsea was valued at £10 in 1298, more than any of the other Roundseas in the same retinue. And perhaps that particular horse was still judged to be a fine example of its type, regardless of its disability. One aspect of horse appraisal not mentioned in English accounts is the practice of branding cavalry horses, although this was carried out in other European countries such as France and Italy. The image on the left is from the Ellesmere manuscript, which was made circa 1400, and it depicts the knight in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. The arrows point to an inverted Y brand on the horse's neck and another which looks like an M on its thigh. And these were the most common areas to brand a horse. One was usually made by the stud which bred the animal, and it served as a mark of identification, useful if it strayed or was stolen. And a second brand was sometimes made when the horse was sold to indicate its new ownership, or was added when it joined a campaign. Routine branding of military mounts after appraisal is mentioned in the Florentine Military Code of 1337, which stated that each and every horse, palfrey, Roundsea and mule should be valued by the marshal and then sent to be branded. It also appears in a French ordinance issued in 1351, which stipulated that after being appraised, all military horses should be branded on the thigh with a hot iron. Now, horses would have needed some kind of restraint to be branded, and they were probably restrained in a stall or travis, such as the one pictured on the right. The reason branding was important to armies was because it was a clear and indelible sign that the horse had been appraised, and it helped prevent improper substitutions. For example, a man-at-arms could take advantage of the system by borrowing an expensive horse for appraisal, but could use his own cheaper horse for the campaign. Such medieval insurance fraud appeared to be somewhat of a problem, for the French ordinance warned all captains to regularly check their troops' horses against the inventory descriptions. In England, royal and baronial studs routinely branded their young stock, but there's no direct evidence that this was carried out as part of the muster process, nor is there evidence of branding irons in the lists of army supplies I've studied to date. Now, it's possible that it was done as part of the appraisal process and the records are simply missing, or that it was not standard practice in English armies. With the appraisal process complete and the inventory drawn up for the campaign, the next most important part of restaurum equorum was recording claims and the reasons for them. Two of the most commonly found terms used to describe what had happened to a horse were mortuus and interfectus. And these both indicate the death of the animal, and at first glance they appear to have been used interchangeably, sometimes by the same scribe on the same day. Here, for example, is a preliminary list of killed and wounded horses made the day after the Battle of Falkirk. The top section, which is crossed out, is Clifford's retinue and lists 7 horses as mortuus, and beneath him is Botort's retinue, with 5 horses recorded as interfectus. It is tempting to suggest there was some subtle difference between these terms. Were some killed outright? Did others die shortly after, or perhaps even have to be culled due to their injuries? It's a possibility, but surely we might expect there would be a mixture of mortuus and interfectus within each retinue. Interestingly, in the main inventory, these terms are switched. So Clifford's horses all become annotated as interfectus and Botort's as mortuus. And this may be a case of scribal error, or perhaps indicates that the terms were interchangeable and simply meant that the horse had been killed. Another term, and one whose meaning we can be confident in describing, is reddita ad caravanum, or handed over to the caravan or baggage train. And this seemed to be a catch-all term to indicate that a horse was suffering some kind of affliction, either injury or sickness. The horses probably were sent to the baggage train, at least initially, as this is where they could be inspected and treated by the horse doctors. And we find evidence of this term's meaning in the case of Simon Clifford and Richard Halstead's horses, which were injured during the Battle of Falkirk and recorded as reddita ad carvanum the following day. But annotations were later added to the main horse inventory, stating that compensation was not to be paid, as both these horses had been restored to health. Clifford's horse was picked up from Durham and Halstead's from Newcastle, and this suggests that the walking wounded were relocated to safe places where they could undergo further treatment, and in some cases be rehabilitated. What went on to happen to the remainder isn't recorded, but they were probably either sold on or absorbed into the king's household. The final term to be addressed is reddita ad eleemosinum, which translates literally as restored as arms, but its meaning is something of a mystery. Andrew Ayton, author of the seminal work Knights and Warhorses, concluded that the term was interchangeable with ad carvanum. But an entry in the wardrobe records 1286 shows a payment made to one John Gillingham for a rancy, which was listed as ad carvanum et postea redditi ad eleemosinum. In other words, the horse was initially sent to the baggage train and afterwards was eleemosinum. It may well be that the literal translation of this term is correct. The horses were handed over to the king's almoners to use piously, perhaps as gifts to local clerics. But these horses don't seem to appear in wardrobe lists of arms. So perhaps there is an alternative explanation, and your suggestions are welcome. So there's clearly more research to be done regarding some of the terminology used by 13th and 14th century horse appraisers. But whatever the meaning behind them, they do indicate that either a horse was dead or unfit to continue on campaign. So to quickly summarise, if you were a man-at-arms serving for royal pay in England during the late 13th and the first half of the 14th century, you could have your war horses insured against death or incapacitation. There might be exclusions if your horse had old injuries, but as long as it wasn't sick or sorry and had at least one eye, you were good to go. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your very interesting intervention. There have been some comments in the chat about blind horses or semi-blind horses. I think I started a trend because we currently have a blind horse whom we have used for mounted combat. And we have one more listener here, the youngest participant, who is just 1 week old.
Oh, lovely.
So now I think the floor is to Jörg. You'll have to share your PowerPoint and we will mute because there will be lots of noise. Yeah. Yeah, and the questions can be discussed after all the three papers, okay? Unless you want, you can answer in the chat as well.
Can you hear me?
Here, yes, see editing screen. Yes, now it's as it should be, but it's on the third slide.
Oh, can you first slide?
It's on the third now.
It's number 3.
Taking a really long time to transmit.
Now it's presenter screen.
Okay.
Да.
Okay, you should see now the the title screen, title page.
No, I'm still seeing the present. Ah, yes,
Yes.
now. Yes, good.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. This is I'm Jörg Gassmann. I'm an independent researcher, and we do have horses. This is one of our horses, Lani Kula. She's about 14.1, and I'm 6 foot. So this about shows the correct relationship to cavalry horses, at least until the mid-19th century. What are the logistical implications about fighting with horses? I'll talk about remount, I'll talk about kit, I'll talk about feeding, waste management, tactical issues. Just for everybody who deals with horses on a day-to-day basis, bear in mind that in the army, every horse-related decision you make, what kit you buy, the feed, the medication, the activity, affects literally thousands of horses. So that is one of the key drivers behind many of these decisions. Now, remounts. If we assume that the active duty of a duty life of a cavalry horse is roughly from age 5 to 15, I'll go into that a bit more. And during that time, you have some attrition due to illness or injury. That means that a unit of 100 horses needs 12 to 13 trained remounts every year. Where do these come from? This requires dedicated expert trainers to train these horses to be fighting fit, and it requires dedicated year-end facilities. So in many of the medieval situations, these facilities is something I haven't seen yet. I'm keeping a lookout for. So if anybody sees something that looks like an arena, I would be very interested. Now, for the late 19th century cavalry, this is the Prussian cavalry and the manual by Prussian cavalry general. The units would receive the untrained 4.5-year horse. There'd be 6 months of solo training. The solo training is done by experienced soldiers in the unit under the supervision of sergeants and a training officer. Then after these 6 months of solo training, they go into the unit. They're ridden by one of the troopers. They're still not considered fully trained until they've done 1 year. Now, all the Western powers, except Britain, in the late 19th century have national studs and remount depots. And these remount depots deliver a standardized cavalry horse to or different kinds of standardized cavalry horses to the units. Britain thought that a remount system was against their free market sensibilities. So in Britain, they just bought horses from breeders. But in British India, they had an excellent remount system. So this was specifically Britain itself. So the supplying cavalry horses was a major thing. You may remember there was a major war between Germany and France, 1870, 1871. Now, 4 years later, in 1875, there was another crisis. It was called the Krieg in Sicht crisis. So the war is imminent crisis, and that was caused by the French changing their militia system, and it was a minor change, but it implied an additional 100,000 remounts needed for the French army, and a rumor went around that France was going to buy them in Germany, and this caused a crisis in Germany. Germany forbade the export of horses to France, and it was a major flap until Bismarck at first talked it up and then had to tamp it down again because it was getting too hot. But this was cavalry horses was considered a strategic asset. Now, in the army, it's not just one horse for every function. For the heavy cavalry, you needed larger, stockier horses because they needed to carry an armored trooper. The light cavalry needed smaller, agile horses, like for the hussar. In German, they're called Husarenkatze. The artillery, the horse artillery, needed fast drafts, and pretty much everybody needed slow draft horses. Why is this important? Because the feed requirement is a function of horse weight, principally. So you always want the smallest horse that can do the job, because you don't want to have to feed more horse than you strictly need. You also want within a unit a standardized size of horse, because you want to be able to allocate the food on a standardized basis. You don't want to have to give a larger horse a bit more, a smaller horse a bit less. You all horses the same size, same weight, so you can give all the same thing. Now, an excursion into small horses, there's principally two documents that I refer to here. One is Sir Walter Gilby, Small Horses in Warfare, where he was himself a soldier. He participated in the Crimean War, and he was absolutely astounded by the fact that these massive English cavalry horses, when they were exported to Britain's war zones in South Africa or in the Middle East, they very rapidly died, and it was mostly hardier but smaller horses that performed the cavalry functions. Von Krane, slightly different, but also for smaller horses. Now here's some pictures of cavalry. Here on the left is a hussar, very typical uniform. He wears a busby, and this the pelisse. It's really a shield to protect the left arm of the trooper. They have a short, strongly curved light saber and a sabretache. This is for carrying messages. Hussars were usually used as messengers, and they were light cavalry. In the middle here is the Bengal Lancers, famous in military history. And here is a French cuirassier. You can see this is heavy cavalry, and it's heavy cavalry. They have heavy boots. You can see here with the hussar, it is a soft leather short boot. They have very heavy boots. You cannot even move in them. You just put your legs in, and that's it. Sorry?
Slides do not shift.
We are still on slide 7.
On slide 7 with the book.
Okay, well, it may take a while for the slide to load then. I am on 8. It may transmit a bit slowly. Sorry.
Yes,
Okay. Well, as I said, this is the hussar here on the left, mostly yellow. Can you see my cursor? This jacket that's on the left shoulder, called the pelisse, that protects the left side against attack. The busby is also protects against sword slashes. There's a light cavalry saber, soft boots, and a sabretache for carrying messages, because they were used as a light cavalry. In the middle, Bengal Lancers from India, and here on the right is a cuirassier wearing a steel cuirass, steel helmet, very heavy boots, and the heavy cavalry saber is larger than light cavalry saber, either very gently bent, curved, or straight, and is mainly used for thrusting and slashing against infantry, whereas the hussars, if they used in battle, they'd be used against other cavalry or against artillery, but not against infantry. So kit, what about kit? Can you see slide 9?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. Now the kit, military equipment has to be rugged and cheap, and it has to be standard. One size fits all. The pinch point for the cavalry is usually the saddles. So there's a two-pronged solution. One is you have a standardized horse. If you have a standardized horse, then you can have a standardized saddle. If all your horses are different, then you need to come up with different saddles. And that is extremely expensive, not just in production, but also when you're in the field and the saddle breaks and you can only use one type of saddle. You cannot swap saddles between horses. That's a problem. And most saddles prioritize horse comfort over rider comfort. It takes a lot longer to train a horse than to train a cavalry trooper. And the horses are much more expensive than the cavalry trooper. So the saddles protect the horse. Rider comfort is secondary. So one of the most successful all-round saddles is the US Cavalry McClellan saddle. Looks like this. Now, I find this very comfortable, but it is a very simple and very effective saddle, and certainly one that is quite comfortable for the horses. Now, feeding. Horses are not picky eaters. They can thrive on just grass. They will eat any fresh forage, but horses have small stomachs and the digestion has to be fed continuously. So you can't just load up a horse. Ingesting the required energy from grass alone requires about 14 hours of grazing. This is time that is not available for a working horse or for a horse on campaign. So what you do? The other thing is, even if you have good grazing, the area that is required for grazing a cavalry unit's horses is larger than can be protected by the unit's troopers. So you need to protect the cavalry's horses. This was a problem for the U.S. cavalry in the far west. Now, issues of kit. The U.S. cavalry experience was they were loaded down with surplus kit. So that means they were much heavier than the Native American raiders and were slowed down in the pursuit. This additional kit exhausted the horses, so they needed to be grained to maintain their energy level, which they had to haul grain, which added even more weight to the horse. So one of the things troopers quickly did is they ditched the sword and they loaded up on pistols. They usually had at least one, usually two pistols, and got rid of the sword. So General Crook, he's the one who rode the mule. His formula for pursuing native raiders is leave the fat troopers behind and allocate their horses to the other troopers, so you had a change of horses. Waste management. Many horses together, especially when it's wet, turn any ground into morass very quickly. As I'm sure you've experienced that. So you need to add straw. This adds to the waste. Horses produce a lot of waste, and the bigger they are, the more waste they produce. So this was used, and this is always a problem in camps. Now, I'm not going to go into waste management too much. You probably all have more than ample experience with this. I just want to point out that arguments about the amount of waste horses produce was used in arguing about the size of Carolingian armies, with one side saying they can't have been large because that would have produced more waste than they could possibly manage, and using calculations based off 16-hand horses rather than the 13 and a half, 14-hand horses the Carolingians probably had. Finally, tactical implications. One of the key tactical concepts is Schwerpunktbildung, Clausewitzian term. It's the ability for the commander to rapidly concentrate forces at a point of the commander's choosing. And the key point here is rapidly concentrate forces. Now, battlefield cavalry itself was pretty much obsolete by the Napoleonic Wars. Through the 19th century, you saw a steady and comparatively rapid obsolescence and decline of cavalry's usefulness on the battlefield. I mean, as heavy cavalry attacking infantry, the rate of fire of the infantry became, and the range of fire of the infantry became so great that it was practically impossible for cavalry to ride a charge. Some still happened, and you had the charge at Kut-el-Amara and the charge at Beersheba in World War I. But those are great exceptions, and there are special circumstances which meant that was successful. But on the other hand, until the advent of motorized battlefield vehicles, that is tanks, in World War I, horses were the only option to rapidly move. So you were in a bind. That meant that cavalry was useful in reconnaissance, in plugging gaps, quickly moving into a gap, or quickly moving through a gap, exploiting a breakthrough. Even in World War I, cavalry were still lined up behind the infantry, ready to exploit the expected breakthrough, which of course never happened. On the other hand, in World War II, the Soviets still fielded cavalry divisions, and they were highly effective against the mechanized German army. Of course, they didn't attack the tanks, but they were able to move very quickly and plug gaps and hold sectors of the front as infantry, not mounted, but they could move very quickly, and they were especially independent of roads and independent of fuel in their ability to move. So that concludes my my talk. If there's anything I can add, happy to take questions after the show. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jörg. This is wonderful overview of war horses from the Middle Ages until the modern era, the Second World War. So
yeah, it's really era independent. These things are inherent in the horses. It's not dependent on any era. This applies at any time, pretty much.
And, yeah, I still find that I think it was in John Clark's book about the horse equipment, how in the previous publications made at the beginning of the 20th century, we didn't need to describe parts of the bit or parts of the horse because people just knew what they meant, and people, medievalists or historians working today, just don't know what horses look like and how they function. And that's a problem. So getting these ideas about the practical things like waste management, feeding horses, this is very useful. I mean, people here probably know much about waste management and feeding horses. Most people do. We are learning a lot because horses have been on our land for 3 weeks now, since the 1st of May. So I have had a horse for 10 years in a livery stable, and now I have learned a lot. That horses eat much more than I would have expected them to eat in spring, and that they do present a problem with waste management sometimes. So now I'll just scroll back a little bit in time into the 19th century and give my small talk about cavalry maidens. So this is a paper which unusually didn't require much research from me, and it's not a research project really, it's just a kind of passion of mine. I mean, if you come from a like Russian culture, there are certain things which are part of your cultural baggage, and that's where we all started. So that's where I started with the Hussar Ballet. So if you belong to the generation which was born into the Soviet Union, like me and Edgar, or older, then this have been part of your cultural baggage. This film, the Hussar Ballet. It's a musical comedy, so there is also a ballet, but this musical comedy, according to Wikipedia, is the most popular kind, and I fully agree with Wikipedia in this case, because it's the kind of film you would have watched again and again. I don't think you could translate it because so many of the songs and the humor, it's not translatable, but it still would be enjoyable. It was made especially for the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Borodino, and the premiere was on the day of the battle in 1962. So it's a very old film. It's still very enjoyable, still very funny, because it was filmed in the Soviet Union. It's copyright free. It could be watched. Though I don't know if you would enjoy it without knowing the language. And it's based on a play a long time ago. So here, if sorry,
World
War II
time play when the Napoleonic Wars were deliberately recalled as like we're doing this again kind of fashion, and that's why
yeah,
the play was made originally.
Yeah, so the film was hugely popular. That was one of aspect of the past which the Soviet Union wanted to remember and glorify, the involvement of women, of one woman in the Napoleonic War. So if you look at this screenshot from the film, you will see a rider on a white horse who is going to gallop, and you will see two horses in harness which are cantering. Just the rider overtakes it easily. So this is from the very beginning of the film. It presents the main heroine, this cavalry maiden, Shurachka, and her future in the film and the play. It's her future husband, the person who is going to change her life. Okay, so I'll try to go to and show a bit from the film. I don't know if you're going to be able to see it. I hope you will. You'll need to share a different screen because it's worth watching. No, it should be. Okay. So, okay, I need to. Okay, I need to load from. Yes, this is true. Okay. Right, I think it's just taking a lot of time to open. Let's see. Okay, so wait a second. I'd like to search the window. Okay. So here it goes. I hope I will share the sound too, because the music is also important. Okay, so that's what I wanted to show, and what is important here is that of course this horse which is galloping, it gives you the idea of this cavalry maiden who is don't see a woman or a man until they start talking, because she is dressed in men's clothes. And
no, not again.
Sorry?
And her reaction, as far as I remember,
it's her uncle.
It's her uncle, yes.
Not
oh
again.
No, not again.
Yes. So you see this gray horse as well. It's an oriental horse. You get this idea of an oriental horse, which is very hot-blooded. If you were careful to watch it, it's very interesting, not about horses, but the fact that there was a church at the beginning in the background. So if you are talking about Napoleonic War and the spirit. It's impossible to get around religion, but because the film was Soviet, it kind of somehow managed not to get it into the picture apart from this church. And in a few places, you kind of could see on the walls something which could look like an icon because it would be inevitable. Somehow they managed to get around the topic of religion. The film was a bestseller. So it's claimed at the end of the film, you will see that it's based on a true story of one particular person. So here is this person, Nadezhda Andreevna Durova, also known as Alexander Durov, Alexander Sokolov, Alexander Andreevich Alexandrov, so many names, most of them male names. She was a heroine of the Napoleonic War. She published her memoir, The Cavalry Maiden. It's available to read if you read in Russian. It's also been translated into German and into English. That's what the first edition looks like. And there were some lithographs and portraits of her where you could see that she's not ugly, but she's not a womanly woman, as you would expect. So her biography is quite extraordinary. Unlike in the film, and unlike the title of her memoir suggests, she is not a maiden. By the time she joined the army, she was married, she had a child. She ran away from her husband with a Cossack, but she couldn't join the Cossack division because first of all, they all had beards and she would have been discovered. Second, you needed to be part of this ethnicity. So she became a hussar and, sorry? Oh, lancer, okay. And she was eventually discovered by Alexander I, who allowed her to stay in the army because of her exploits, and she was awarded the cross for what she did. So, the cross of St. George, you can see it basically on all paintings of her, you would see the cross of St. George. Later, she was injured in battle. She in the leg, and she couldn't continue active service. She was in the headquarters of Kutuzov for a while, but because of her injury, she had to retire. And after she retired, she retained the title under which she served in the army. She always wore male clothes. She wanted to be addressed only as Alexander. She was very angry. She was addressed as Nadezhda, as a woman. What she did, she was basically writing. After the Cavalry Maiden, she was writing additional notes to her memoir, and she was publishing this. So the Cavalry Maiden, it was published with the involvement of Pushkin, who wrote a preface and who was very much interested in this lady. He knew her brother, and probably it was her very unusual persona, her charisma, very unusual story as well. And she was quite popular, and she continued to publish things up to her death. It was basically one of the sources of her income. An interesting fact that when her son wrote to her asking for a blessing for marriage, she addressed her as mom, and she just instantly rejected the letter. And he wrote another letter addressing her as Alexandra with all her official regalia, the official way, and she kind of granted her blessing at this point. There have been a lot of theories why she did it. Pushkin himself, in the introduction, he was writing as a question, a rhetorical question, why did she do this young lady who was noble, who had a husband, a family, a son, why did she do this? It would have been whatever you make out of it. Recently, there was a theory that she was transsexual. I don't think it's a theory she would have liked herself or he. I just want to get into this more closely. Especially as she ran with a man. I think somebody has got his microphone or her microphone on. if you got background noise, maybe you could mute yourself. Okay. So what is interesting in this story, not just that she was a woman who was riding. Obviously, if you join the army, you have to ride because that's the only way, unless you're in the infantry. For a noble person, is the only way to get from place to place. But as in the film, she had a fine horse. That's a picture from a story from a novel for children. There is a grey horse called Alkid, and in her memoirs, she does mention there is a horse Alkid, which was very important. That the horse on which she rode from her home, and which was later killed in an accident. So this horse was very important. She had a very strong relationship with this horse. So in the film, The Hussar Ballad, which is loosely based on her story, the horse is just there, but no special relationship is mentioned, unless you just see this very prominent, very hot-blooded, very lovely grey horse following her everywhere. But luckily, we have another fiction work, and that's the work of a children's writer, Lydia Charskaya. So she is a writer who lived at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. She was a best-selling writer. She had lots of novels for children, fairy tales, poems. Actually, she had some points in common with her protagonist, with the protagonist of Courageous Life, the novel which is based on the story of Nadezhda Durova. With Lydia Charskaya, she also was a divorcee with a son. She had to earn her living, but she decided to do it in a very womanly way by writing stories for books for children. She didn't become wealthy, although her books were bestsellers. She just got the income from the first edition. Many of her books feature a girl who is very much a tomboy, who rides horses or ponies, who behaves like a boy. So that's a common place in many of her books. They're fascinating books for children. I don't know, some of them have been translated into English. They're worth reading. They're full of Orientalist stereotypes, of gender stereotypes and everything. They're nevertheless very engaging, and just something you want to read on a rainy and depressing day. So Courageous Life is based on Nadezhda Durova's biography. And there are some changes, because in Courageous Life, the lady Nadezhda, she's a maiden. There is no this slightly scandalous suggestion of leaving a husband and running away with a Cossack, but there is the horse Alkid. And there are some details which I haven't found in Nadezhda Durova's notes, and that's how she got this horse. So according to the novel, what drew me in the first place is this horse was bought by Nadezhda's father. It's a Karabakh horse, so an Oriental horse, rightly, as we saw in the film. And this was untamed and very fierce, very wild. No groom could approach it, but Nadezhda's father, who is a very fine rider, a very fine cavalryman, he tamed this horse and broke it in. And there is a suggestion that he broke it in through force. And then his daughter, who is tomboy, she was fascinated by this horse. And stealthily at night, she began to bring him, okay, I'll round up tidbits, bread and everything. And she reproduced this process of taming, but as the author says, by meekness, by kindness, rather than by strength. And she began by feeding the horse and taking it out of the stall and riding it in the yard. And then she just went on nightly expeditions and was and was found out one day, but her father just allowed her to ride this horse. And one day she ran away from home to join the army. And she was very much attached to this horse, both in the novel and in her memoirs. The sad thing is that which really happened in her life, which Nadezhda Durova describes in her biography, is that there was an accident when the horse, which had been stabled for a few days after a battle, when there was an interim in the military activities, the horses broke out of the stalls, and her horse was trying to jump a fence, but got impaled on a pole and died. And this is in the novel, you see it as a turning point in Nadia's career, because it was a link which kind of linked her past and her present lives. And then the death of this horse was a tragedy, obviously. It's something you get in her biography as well. So we have to round up. So it has been claimed that Nadia Durova is the first military officer in the Russian army. It's not true. There have been other precedents, like the Amazon squadron, which was purely ceremonial. There were foreign officers, like the Greek lady who became the first woman admiral of the Imperial Russian Navy. And after Nadia Durova, I wanted to bring to your attention these young ladies, Olga and Tatiana, daughters of Nikolai II, who were patrons of mounted squadrons. And these young ladies, why they were, I think it's very interesting to mention them, because they took their duties very seriously. They trained to ride very well, and they could really command their squadrons during. So it wasn't purely honorary titles for them. Of course, they didn't go to battle, but they knew the details. They knew how to do it. So lots of avenues for further exploration, and thank you for your attention. Okay. And I'll stop sharing. People would start the discussion. How do I stop sharing?
You already did.
Okay, I'm good. So I could see the chat if there were anything in the chat which I have missed. So let's see.
There is one question for you.
Okay, yeah, I'll start at that because I can see Kate's question for Jörg. Kate was asking if on campaign, how did a mounted force generally move per day?
Yeah, it's a bit a difficult question. You have to differentiate of whether they are moving in friendly territory or in enemy territory, whether you're moving with the army or just as a mounted unit, because at the day's end, you still need to be in a camp. So if you're in friendly territory, you can move from depot to depot. There will be food there. As I said, horses, if they're fed just on grass, need a lot of grass to meet their energy needs, and it takes long for them to eat it. So that's why you grain them, because you can give them a bit more calories. You can give them a lot more calories in concentrated feed. So that really is the problem. An army on the march would move about 20 kilometers a day, so about 13, 14 miles a day. That is a fairly effective distance to advance. I mean, it seems incredibly slow to us, but if you consider breaking off camp, loading everything up, getting especially the heavy transports to move, arrive, set up tents, start cooking, the first unit to leave, or rather the last units to leave the previous camp, are probably leaving as the first units have already arrived in the new camp. And the function of cavalry would usually be to spread out on the sides of the army on the march and make sure there are no surprises. Reconnoiter, get forage for the horses. That's one of the functions of hussars, was to collect forage. So effectively, even though you could move a lot faster than these 20 kilometers during a day, the question is, what is your organization to enable you to do that? So if you're moving from within your own territory from one barracks to the next, you can easily cover 80 kilometers. You can buy horses in a day. you'll be able to fight with them at the other end. But as long as you have stables, you can put them in good food, you know, you can do that. But that is, you know, that's not something you can do in enemy territory. Anyway, I hope that went partway to answering the question.
Oh. Yes, thank you very much, Jörg. There is a hand raised from Irina Mattioli. Irina, feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question.
Okay, here I am. Good evening, everybody. Thank you to the three of you for these very interesting papers. So my question is for Emma. It turned out that we are studying the same thing, but I'm working on documents from communal Italy in the late 13th century. So thank you for this. It was very interesting. I'm gonna reach out to you in private as well, and
Please
I'd
do.
love to meet in the future. I'm doing a PhD in co-tutel between the University of Milano in Italy and St Andrews in the UK. I work on Perugia, an Italian city-state right in the center of Italy near Tuscany. Mainly my documents range from the 70s of the 13th century to the end of the century. My inspections of horses are quite similar to yours, but they're not just for military expeditions, but also for diplomatic embassies or general purposes like the commune, in order to be able to know like about how many horses could they rely on. They used to do these inspections every now and then, mainly at the beginning of the year, and then checking again at the end of the year. During the year, some of these horses and knights were required to ride their mount, not just for battles, but also for like trips to the papal curia or to nearby city-states.
Right.
So my question is more like a bunch of questions fused in one, because I could see that our documents are very similar, and even in their like lack of informations. For instance, do you find that the horse's economic evaluation is consistent, like through time, but also in the very same military expedition? Because in my documents, very often ronces, for instance, are valued way more than equi, and apparently ridden by high-rank lords as well, not just by a lower rank like knights or people. Also, apparently, in my documents so far, I'm building a database, and I am now at about 1,000 horses listed. In my documents, the main distinction used is between equi and ronces, inferring that equi are often destriers or palfreys, but somehow it's not specified. I realized this because, I mean, if you're riding to battle, at least according to Italian sources, you're expected to ride a destrier, like not a lower quality rank horse. Also in like the request for reimbursement for the very same horse that has been previously listed as a hecus, in the reimbursement papers it's addressed as palfrey, for instance. So I realized that it had a lot to do about also like about who was writing the list, the inspections, and for some reason it wasn't considered something to be specified at that moment. Same for the age. It's one of the things that intrigued me the most, because I realized that age is missing, though age it was probably playing a huge role on the value of the animal. Your comment about like being in a rush in a military context, it's more than reasonable. Though in my documents they're not always in a military context, and often they do this like plenty in advance before leaving, and age is always missing. Maybe because it was something too hard to assess. Not sure about this, or something that was like easily like deceiving. In like maybe you have a bad horse, a bad looking horse, a not very beautiful horse, and you can suppose it's also older. Maybe it's not. It's like bad fed or so sorry, because this is not like a question, it's a bombing, but I'm so excited because it's a very little studied topic, as you said, and it's super interesting to find someone to share.
It is. Yeah, I've actually just dropped you my email in the chat because I think we've got
brilliant.
an awful lot to discuss. Just to very quickly address a couple of the terminology. It is consistent, is that there seems to be a strata which is dependent on rank with destriers, equi and roundcy, but the terms were flexible. Edward II didn't mention roundcies at all. His was just equi